as this week we come to the 14th Sunday or weekend of our liturgical year, and the readings, the first reading comes from the Old Testament or Hebrew prophet Zechariah, and it would be chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. The second reading continues a section from Paul's letters to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 9, and then verses 11 through 13. So number 10 is left out on that one. And finally, the Gospel of Matthew this time is chapter 11, verses 25 through 30. So as we remember, looking with these discussions or talks really at the overall development of the Matthew Gospel, you remember that last time the material that we looked at ended with chapter 10. Now this time we're in chapter 11, but you will notice we are starting at verse 25, so perhaps it might be interesting just to briefly fill out what happened or what is left out in the first 24 verses of chapter 11, because if we ended with chapter 10, we begin now with this section of chapter 11. And part of the reason for that is that some of this was looked at earlier in the year during the season of Advent when we were considering the prophet John the Baptist. So here's the kind of material that's left out, but again, you won't hear this on Sunday or this weekend, but it is perhaps important to get an overview of Matthew's story. So verses 1 through 10 of chapter 11 deal with John the Baptist, who is pictured in Matthew's story as in prison. So in fact, in Matthew's account, John the Baptist really is off the scene by the time that Jesus begins his ministry. And you will remember that John sends word to Jesus, are you the one that we are to look for, or should we expect another? And Jesus sends back the message to the Baptist, well, look what is happening. The blind see, the deaf hear, the good news is proclaimed to the poor. And they take off, and then Jesus says to the group whom he is teaching, there has been no greater prophet than John the Baptist, but those who accept my words are the most important. And so you get all of that background again with regard to the Baptist. Now, verses 11 through 19 deal with children. Now, and it's a little story, again, having to do with the Baptist and the message of Jesus and the Baptist. And he pictures in this episode that the children are in the marketplace. All right, now that would be a busy, obviously, situation where many people would be gathered together. And the writer pictures children of this generation as sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. Namely, children are playing games, and two games, interestingly. One is they play the game of a funeral, and the other is the game of a wedding. I suppose those would be two things that children would have been, well, maybe not part of, but certainly aware of. And as they're sitting there playing this game, so you can kind of remember young children imitate what they see. The gospel writer says, well, the children who are playing the funeral kind of dirges and that kind of thing, they don't want to participate. Then the children who play the wedding, they don't want to participate. They argue with one another that they're not going to accept. Now, what is the whole point of this little episode? You can go back and check this. This is not one of the regular readings that we will hear liturgically. But just as, and here's the point, are we going to connect the dirge with the Baptist and the weddings with Jesus? But just as they reject both, so some, and this again is important to notice, it's almost like a court proceeding. They're sitting here, whose ways do you accept? Well, they refuse to accept the message of John, and there are those who refuse to accept the teaching of Jesus, and so they simply don't accept. Now, it's important to notice that in the first century world, and this would have been true also in Matthew's time, and we continually come back to this point to remember that Matthew is writing for an audience of his own, living sometime in the 80s or early 90s of the first century, so well after the time of Jesus and after the time of Jerusalem's fall, which remember had occurred in the year 70, that at this point in time, there are little different groups of Jews, and now he points back that in Jesus' time, there were Jews who accepted the teaching of John, and many who didn't. There were some who accepted the teaching of Jesus, and many who didn't. So that it isn't, and that's important to notice, that all Judaism refused the Baptist, or all Judaism refused Jesus, but that there were these little pockets who did accept. And therefore, there was a tension, obviously, that went on. So all of that, again, a little bit of a background as a reminder that there is a certain edge that Matthew's story has with regard to fellow Jews of his own time. And we will see that a little bit as the readings for this week unfold. So that's what happens in verses 11 through 19. And then in verses 20 to 24, which are the remaining ones, Jesus offers a reproach to cities, to certain cities that are mentioned. Now, you need a little geography map here to kind of appreciate this. He reproaches the city of Chorazin, Bethsaida, Tyre and Sidon, and finally, even Capernaum. Now, you'll remember that all of these were places that were well known even in Matthew's time. Chorazin is in the upper part of Galilee. It's about 2 miles from the city of Capernaum, and it was a medium-sized town. Apparently had a pretty good business going on. Keep in mind that in those days, the length of the Sea of Galilee was longer. We may have mentioned this, that the Sea of Galilee in our time is considerably shrunk because of the usage of water, either because there is a more human demand for the use of water, or for various reasons, the tributaries that filled the Sea of Galilee, and there were 4 major ones, some of those waterways have been diverted over into the Jordan, and so therefore the actual amount of water coming into the Sea of Galilee is less than it was, say, in first century times. So many of these cities that are mentioned, Chorazin and Bethsaida, actually were a seaport, or a lake port, if you want, for the Sea of Galilee. Today, that is all gone. Much vegetation is there, and these places are inland, and you would say, well, really, how did that happen? Well, that's the background for that. Bethsaida, known as the house of the fishermen, is in the northeastern corner of the Sea of Galilee, and it had really been raised up to the status of a city by Herod Philip, who was one of the three sons, you remember, of Herod the Great, and he had named it Bethsaida Julia in honor of the wife of Herod, or the wife of the Emperor Augustus. Now, so that's a little bit of background about this place. And it also, we are told, was the hometown of three of Jesus' disciples, Philip, Andrew, and Peter. Now, it therefore was an industrial, well, in the best we would call fishing, an industry of the time. So when Jesus says that they refused to accept, you see, so that people would be aware of that. Tyre and Sidon are two cities on the Mediterranean coast. They are in southern Lebanon, and the separation between the two is about 22 miles. So they are not immediately together. They would be non-Jewish cities or outside the territory of Palestine, but would have again been known for being very prosperous because of their location on the Mediterranean Sea. And finally, Jesus then says, and you, Capernaum, do you think you, or Capernaum, depending on how you want to say that, do you think that you're so great? And this place, of course, is located 2.5 miles from the mouth of the Jordan River. And again, the Jordan River is the river that flows into the Sea of Galilee, but as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, it was supported by 4 other streams that gave to it, so that, like waterways go, little streams go into bigger streams get ever bigger, and finally the water flows into, well, in this case, a body that has no outlet, namely the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. So, all of these, in this little section that's left out, are brought to task by Jesus for not accepting his message. And the point is, if they had heard this, if these places had heard my message, they would have accepted it. But they didn't, and so they therefore are going to pay, well, not pay the price, but are not going to be followers. All of that leads now to verses 25 through 30. This is a unique section in the Matthean tradition because in this tradition here, what am I talking about? There is a relationship established by Jesus as the Son to the Father. Now, the relationship of Father and Son is exceptional, as I've mentioned, in the synoptic tradition, although it is certainly very much used in the fourth gospel. And as noted on a few occasions, we need to be a little careful that we do not interpret some of the thinking that goes on in the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in terms of what we have learned from the fourth gospel. Now, Jesus is pictured as saying here, no one knows a son except a father, and no one knows a father except the son, and anyone to whom the son elects to disclose him. I suppose our modern term might be something that we often might say, like father, like son. And that's a little bit what this little part of the episode is hoping us to understand, that Jesus, the Son, is reflecting or acting like the Father would. Now, as I mentioned, this close affinity of Jesus being the Son to God the Father is unique in a certain way to the synoptic tradition. Now, fathers and here a little bit, perhaps once again, a background of the culture of the time of the Mediterranean world, a father was like a patron to a place. That would be what we would probably say now in the best sense of the word, a godfather. That is someone who would be helping and protecting. Here, Jesus, Father, is truly in charge of the human existence of all creation. And Jesus is pictured as the Father's broker, who mediates between the Father, who is the patron, and the people who are the clients. So keep in mind, this is one of the kind of relationships that we would not immediately notice with regard to this gospel and how this relationship is turned. Jesus is truly in charge of human existence and of all creation. So therefore, as I mentioned, Jesus is, what is his relationship as the Son, is the broker of the Father's goods. Now, a patron, that would be the Father, freely selects the clients and then decides to treat the clients as if they were family. As we've mentioned in other times, family is the most important concept, obviously, in the first century world as it is even today. And we mentioned earlier on in other discussions how family was understood and how that all kind of worked. But the question here, who are God's clients? And in this understanding from the viewpoint of Matthew, as Jesus presents it, are the simple or the powerless people. They are unable to do or to obtain anything for themselves. In that sense, and you got to be careful here, but in that sense, they are considered to be children. Because, as we have noted perhaps on other occasions, children would fall into the weakest of classes. They would be most vulnerable, as we know a little bit about children coming into the world at that time, that 30% of all children born died at birth. So very different from our world, where that would be most unusual. And of those who survived, now so 30% gone, but of those who survived, by the time of age 6, 30% had died. And finally, the statistics that we can put together from how things worked at this time, 60% did not live past their 16th birthday. So when we think of children being born in this circumstance, there was a very high unfortunate death rate because we did not know or did not have the medicine or the ability to care for them. Also, as we have noted before, children at this point were considered, from the viewpoint of society, as having no rights. Children were actually treated in the same category as slaves. And so childhood, now we kind of hope that childhood for our children is a pleasant time. We know, unfortunately, that many times it isn't, but that the model that we have, the image that we develop, is that it is a wonderful time in which children grow up. We hope grow up under the aspect of mom and dad and kind of learn values that are important for their life when they grow older. But when children in Jesus' time, see, were not considered in the same way. And as we mentioned last time, families raised children, And so they were subject not only to the whims of the father and the mother, although it is true to say that, again, in a society that we now know something more about, that mothers were the most influential for children in learning things until they reached the stage of becoming an adult, which was about 12 years old, and then it became the responsibility of the men or the father to share the values, particularly with their son, that would be important. So all of that lies behind the reference here in this section with regard to little ones. Now Jesus is pictured, and we will hear these words, I give you thanks. So he makes an acclamation with regard to God the Father, that he realizes his relationship. So it's a public proclamation of praise and thanks for what God has done. Father, Lord of heaven and earth. And what the passage says, what you have not given to the wise and the understanding, you have given to the little ones. Now, here's where we kind of get that tension. Who are the wise and understanding? Well, this refers to the scribes and Pharisees who reject Jesus. So again, keep that in mind. It is not all the Pharisees, it is not all the scribes, it is those scribes and Pharisees who will not accept Jesus. Now there are certain parallels here in verses 25 through 27 to the gospel tradition of Luke. And I mentioned this, we've mentioned before, that both Luke and Matthew seem to have had access to some teachings of Jesus that are found in what are known as the source, the Qa'al, the Q source. So again, there might be similarity, and are similarities found in chapter 10 of Luke, also in this regard. So I just mentioned this in passing. And so now we come to verse 28. All you who toil and are burdened. Now, who addresses this, we think, these words, to those who stand outside the circle of disciples. So, who are those who are burdened? Well, and here you get, unfortunately, this kind of tension between Matthew's believers and the Hebrew or Pharisee community who stand outside or against Matthew. So he says, they lay heavy burdens. Well, what are these heavy burdens? It's their interpretation of the Torah, their interpretation of the law. And also, in fairness, but in honesty, the Pharisees were known to add interpretations to the Torah, to the law. Yes, this is what the law says, but they would then say, this is what the law means. And this is where the accusation that they are laying heavy burdens upon others comes into play. What Jesus is saying, those who accept his way, for my burden is easy and my burden is light, depart from those which have been imposed by Jewish teachers and choose to follow Jesus. Now, one finds rest by taking upon oneself the yoke of Jesus. Take my yoke upon you basically has to do with teachings that revolve around the observance of the Sabbath. Now, even when one looks at the great commandments. Remember the 10 commandments. Remember, there is one commandment which says, remember to keep holy the Sabbath. And there are a number of interpretations that would be given by the Pharisees in that regard. So that would be, now we've noticed often in the past the idea of a yoke. A yoke, of course, was used to join two animals together. And as we also mentioned in the past, that every yoke, now when we think of a yoke being put on an animal, and now the imagery on a human, but every yoke put on an animal was what we would use the word phrase today, custom designed. It wasn't just one yoke, but every yoke was appropriately fixed for each animal so that there wouldn't be a lot of pain, and that would enable them to work much more easily. In a certain way, perhaps that lies behind Jesus saying that my yoke and my is easy, my rest is easy. So these lines that we heard this time, by the way, many of the older generation of Catholics would have known, because it is one of the more popular phrases taken from the Gospels that was used by many preachers and teachers in earlier times and still used today. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Well, important to remember, as contrasted to those of the group that this Matthew group is tensioning with. I mention this kind of frequently because it's important to try to put, as we will do on our homilies, put the teaching of Jesus into 21st century context. And we may not need the context of the first century world, although maybe sometimes reflection upon it would be important. The first reading from Zechariah is a phrase that is, or a passage, by the way, that is used on Palm Sunday. And it refers about the fact that the Messiah will come riding on a donkey, which was considered to be, you remember, this animal was the workforce, you know, the one they used out in the fields, but also was considered to be humble. But in this case, do not think of humility as weakness, but rather keep in mind that it is understood as something very different, that and that the king who rides upon the donkey should recognize his own limitations. So there is a bit more to this, but what perhaps is important to notice here is why this particular animal is brought to our attention is that God will destroy the instruments of war, because usually military rode on horses, which were considered to be, and still are, wonderful stallions and indicators of power. But this king, this Messiah who comes, and of course the reference as we interpret it is to Jesus, comes as a peaceable Messiah, not as a warlike Messiah. And that was kind of a tension. The donkey also remembers Israel's poor economy, and in bringing some of these reflections kind of quickly to a conclusion here, as we have mentioned before, the little ones that are mentioned, although we have talked about children, the little ones in the world of the first century would be those who were the powerless. And there's where children, as we mentioned earlier on, were powerless. They had no rights. They could be treated and hopefully would be treated kindly, but often were mistreated. They often represented the poor. The little ones had no access to the powers that would enable them to provide economically for their families. So there were many ways in which little ones here should not be seen simply as children, or when the term children is used, it is seen as those who were without power. This Messiah, this Jesus, this peacemaker, comes to bring into the world a new way of living and a new challenge to how things would be working out. So all of that lies behind this very familiar and beautiful little passage, "My yoke is easy and my burden light." Well, yes, in regard to certain laws and rules, but in terms of the protection, the care, remember, and here Jesus is the broker between God the patron and his clients, who are all of us. And in that sense, Jesus has the mediator role, and this certainly is very important in our belief, in our tradition, and in our practice. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.